Hello, my name is Dr. Ann Johns, and I am a professor in the Department of Art and Art History at the University of Texas at Austin. My specialty is the art and architecture of the Middle Ages and Renaissance in Italy. So today what I'm going to be talking about is the history and constructions and the ideas around the building of domes in Western art. And by Western art, we don't mean cowboys and Indians. What we mean by Western art, for the most part, is Europe and the Americas. I'm going to be assuming that maybe you know a little something about one of the most important ancient domes, and this is the dome of the Pantheon. The Pantheon was this incredible, massive dome that was built, and really it captured the imagination of people in Europe for thousands of years, essentially up until the present day afterward. Fortunately for us, National Geographic came up with a nice display here that shows the sizes of many of these dome structures. And we have domes here in both what we think of as the West and the East. So we have the Dome of the Pantheon, we have the Dome of the Florence Cathedral, we have things like the Dome of the Taj Mahal, the Dome of Hagia Sophia in modern-day Istanbul. And so you can get a sense from this image of how big these different domes are. So the first ones we're going to be talking about, the principal ones, are the Dome of the Florence Cathedral or Duomo, and then comparing it with its ancient predecessor, the Pantheon. So we're talking about a difference of about 1,300 years. This dome is built, and it is a marvelous structure, and then Rome falls. And basically, you may know something about this from your history classes. Rome is this massive empire that spans much of Europe, all around the Mediterranean. And then through a series of things that we haven't entirely figured out, the whole empire falls. Before this happens, though, one of the Roman emperors by the name of Constantine moves to a small city in modern-day Turkey that was known as Byzantium, and he very modestly builds a new city that he names after himself, Constantinople. This is the city of Constantine. Rome falls. There are a series of Germanic and Asian tribes that come down through Europe into Italy, and basically much of ancient Rome is destroyed. You can see all of these different invasions into poor Rome. Look at the arrows. They're coming from every which direction. So they didn't have a chance. But you can get a sense of how kind of out of this path of invasions Constantinople is. So this is important for us because, in fact, we have many different things that contribute to the development of domes in this new capital of Constantinople. So we have the Imperial Court of Rome moving to Constantinople. We have the fall of Rome. But what happens in the meantime is we have this loss in Europe of the technological knowledge of how to create these domes. And in particular, we have the loss of knowledge about something that you may think of as being the most ordinary thing in the world, and that is concrete. Okay? Think about how concrete, that's not very exciting, but concrete is cheap and it's flexible, and it was the material basically that built the Roman Empire. So after Constantine moves to Constantinople, we don't have that technology anymore at all. In Constantinople, Constantine has some beautiful structures built, absolutely gorgeous. This is an image of the Hagia Sophia that is built a little bit after Constantine by the Emperor Justinian, who you can see here in this beautiful mosaic portrait. So we still have domed structures, but they are not occurring in Europe. In Europe, they have this sort of dream of domes and this dream of Rome, and they want to create buildings that look like the Pantheon, but they don't really know how to do this. So I'm going to show you a couple examples of domed structures that are these kind of I don't want to say pathetic, but they don't really have the technology for making anything like the Pantheon. So we have this wonderful monument of Theodoric here. You can see that's in Italy. This is actually all stone. So this thing is a very strange monument. It's sort of on the outskirts of a famous city in Italy, and you can see that the dome is 36 feet wide, but it's solid stone. Any wider than that and the whole thing probably would have collapsed. Okay, so they don't really know what they're doing, and stone obviously is much heavier than concrete, and so you can't continue to make your dome bigger and bigger if it's stone. You have to carve it, and that's hard. You have to lift it without any sophisticated technology, and then you have to span this space. So this is a singular monument. We don't have very many things quite like this. On the right, we have the dome of the baptistry where people were baptized in Pisa. And you can tell that this is Pisa because you can see over here that very famous leaning tower that everybody knows. We have other dome structures such as the little shrine of San Galgano on the left. We also have domes in the city of Florence, in particular, once again, a baptistry. But again, you can see how shallow the dome is. It's not a high dome. It's not a wide dome. So Florence in the Renaissance. Florence is often synonymous with the Italian Renaissance of the 15th and 16th centuries. And what I show you here is a view of Florence that was made during the Renaissance. And as you look over it, you notice right away that the dome is the most prominent thing. And even today in Florence, the dome is so extraordinarily large. It is huge. It looms over everything. And Florence has been very careful not to build other skyscrapers and other buildings that would compete with it. So the scale of this dome is actually much more astonishing than the Pantheon in many ways. It is absolutely huge. Now the Florentines, it's quite amazing. They planned this dome for about 100 years, but they had no idea how they were going to build it. Literally, they had no idea. But they made some images of it. Here is a painted version of what they thought it might look like from the 14th century. So from the 1300s, it's actually much smaller in scale here than it would eventually look like. But you can see they had an idea of what they wanted it to look like, which is this octagonal structure, 8 sides, an octagon, that fit on top of what is basically a medieval church. So you can see here some of the similarities between the painted version and what eventually happened. So they had this idea about what they wanted, but they had no more idea how to build it than I do. I mean, they didn't have, how are you going to do this? How are you going to make it so tall? How are you going to make it structurally sound? How are you going to make it so it doesn't collapse? No one knew until, one of the most important figures of the Renaissance, and this is Filippo Brunelleschi. Filippo Brunelleschi was a Florentine. He actually trained as a goldsmith. He lost a very important sculpture competition in Florence and sort of decided he was going to go to Rome with his best friend Donatello and go look at stuff. Yes, indeed, we are talking about the same Donatello who was the namesake for one of the Ninja Turtles. So Donatello and Brunelleschi go to Rome, they look at the Pantheon, and Brunelleschi comes back with some ideas about how to do this. And there is a competition in Florence, and Brunelleschi wins the competition. What you see here in the middle is, in fact, the wooden model that Brunelleschi himself made. This model still doesn't have what we call the lantern on the top. Okay, but it shows this structure here. And this is really quite large. So the Florentines said, well, we don't really know how you're going to do it. It's a little scary, but yes, we're going to give you this giant commission to make this giant dome. So here are some of the elements that go into making a dome, a sort of more Renaissance or modern dome. And it's different from the Pantheon, but it is a dome that, if you think about the Texas Capitol, you recognize some of these elements. So what do we see here? we see that the drum, which is the base of the dome, the drum is a really strong structure that supports the weight of the dome. Then we see tiles, terracotta tiles over this. We see the ribs, okay, and the ribs are these marble sections that correspond to each of the parts of the octagon. And then we see this lantern on the top. So what is the big deal here? Well, this is a very heavy structure that is up high, and you know that thing called gravity, okay? Well, gravity wants to push down on this and sort of make it collapse. So what Brunelleschi had to come up with was a system of supports that were not going to allow this to collapse, not going to allow this giant structure to sort of fall in on itself. So what does he do? This drum that I talked about, this support at the base, was part of the structure that supported this. Brunelleschi comes up with the idea, perhaps from looking at the baptistry just across the way, of doing a double shell. The double shell, of course, lightens the load. So this is not as heavy, say, as, remember that stone dome that we looked at. This is much lighter. And then he uses what we call herringbone brickwork, and this is just brickwork that you might see on a sidewalk somewhere. So here you can see we have the octagonal drum, and this drum, by the way, this is 140 feet in diameter. It's absolutely huge. And then we have the cupola or dome. We have the drum that supports it, and then, as I said, we have these double shell domes. And what I'm showing you here in this image is you can walk up to the top, and what's going on here with these stairs? This is the double shell dome. You can see that double shell dome. So all of this portion in here that would be weight is cut away. And then we have, from the same photo, you can see this is what I'm calling this herringbone brickwork. And what this is if you think about a piece of stone or even a slab of concrete, it's not very flexible. And if you think about brick, you've got smaller pieces of brick, and then you've got the mortar between the brick, and you can have a little bit of give. And the architects and builders can bit by bit make that brick curve as the dome needs to curve. And so you can create this web, but it's very, very flexible. We're not sure where he got these ideas, and there's been a lot of research recently about how he may have been looking at Islamic architecture, because these are features that are used in Islamic architecture. The question is, where would he have seen this? How would he have seen this? We don't know that yet, but it's interesting to think about those sort of cross-cultural possibilities. The other thing that he did that was different is, typically when you build a dome, you build a wooden form, okay? So you build this sort of wooden model, and then you go up with all the bricks or all the stones, and then you pull the wooden model away. Well, when you're talking about a dome that's 140 feet in diameter and massive, you can't do that. There's not enough trees in the whole country of Italy, and there's no trees tall enough to make a wooden form or structure such as had been done in Roman architecture and in medieval architecture. So Brunelleschi comes up with the idea that they'll be self-buttressing, and so he builds scaffolding. If you've ever seen scaffolding around buildings as they're working on buildings, and they sort of build it up bit by bit. So he does away with this wooden form, and it may not seem like a big thing to you, but this is basically the way architecture had been created in Europe and much of the Mediterranean for centuries. And so it's a very new idea that he would use that scaffolding. Okay, now on the outside of the dome, what he did on this sort of exoskeleton is what we call the outside. What we see are these 8 ribs, and remember, this is an octagon, okay? And so the ribs are at the point where the dome has to sort of bend, to form these different 8 parts. What the ribs do, and this is just so brilliant, what the ribs do, though, because they are heavy, is they sort of counter that thrust that is caused by gravity. So you have gravity trying to sort of push the dome down, but you have these ribs pushing in, and this creates a balance and a sense of stasis, so that the dome, doesn't collapse. And then those ribs are locked at the top with the lantern. It's almost like an umbrella, okay? So you think about those metal spikes in an umbrella that then are all gathered together at that top portion. And that is, somebody must have been looking at the dome when they made those, because that's exactly how that works. If that top part comes off, spring, go all of the metal pieces of your umbrella. The same thing would happen here with a little bit more disastrous consequences, right? It would fall down on everybody. Hopefully that will never happen. We also have another feature that helps keep the dome from collapsing in on itself, and these are what are called tribunes, and they're additional buttresses, and they're sort of semi-domes, and they're smaller, and there are several of them sort of at the base of that dome to sort of push up against it to keep the whole thing from collapsing. So again, we're talking about somebody going from looking at the baptistry, that's across the way with this little teeny dome, this little flat dome, to Brunelleschi imagining this whole complex structure. And it really is one of the architectural and engineering feats, one of the great feats of the Renaissance, or almost any time that he would reimagine this. This provided the model for domes essentially for the rest of the time in much of Europe and the Americas. So for instance, when Michelangelo, about a century later, was asked to build a dome for St. Peter's, he very much used Brunelleschi's as a model. The story is he actually worked on St. Peter's and on this dome for no salary. Which may sound very, very noble, except that he's very, very rich at this point, so he doesn't really need the salary. So he's doing this for the honor, I suppose. He turned to his Florentine roots. And I think what you can see here is how the materials are very different. The dome in Rome is all marble, and it's slightly bigger, but in fact, it is very much based with these ribs and the lantern and the double shells, just like Brunelleschi's. And just like in Florence, you can actually go up the dome at St. Peter's, and you go through these two shells, just as you do in Florence. And we have a famous quote that we think that maybe he really did say, you never know, but it seems like it is an actual quote of Michelangelo's, in which he says, his dome is larger, but not more beautiful. And Michelangelo was not the sort of person to give credit to anybody. And so for him to sort of give this nod to Brunelleschi was an incredible compliment to the genius of Brunelleschi. And also Michelangelo acknowledging that he got an idea from somebody else is just pretty astonishing. So he was not a modest man. He was not a particularly friendly man either. But he was a great artist, so, I guess we don't care. So from here on in, this idea of this Florentine dome, as sort of translated by Michelangelo in Rome, becomes the model for domes. And so we begin to see this reiteration, this repeating of this design. And so we see, for instance, in London, St. Paul's, which is this, grand church with this large dome. The dome is very much based on Michelangelo's dome in Rome. Our Capitol's dome is also very much based on this, which is kind of funny because we were founded as a country in which religion and state were separate, and hopefully will remain separate. And yet the model for the dome is the most important church in Christendom. And that's partly because at this point this dome had just become so universal. If you think of a dome, this is the dome you're thinking of. And so it becomes the model for our Capitol. And if you look at the Capitol, it's a very sort of looks like an ancient Roman building, very classical, but it's got Michelangelo's dome on top of it. In part, this is because our founding fathers were very conversant with what was going on in Rome. They were also very conversant with ancient architecture. And so somebody like Thomas Jefferson, would have been making very deliberate choices and helping architects to come up with some of these ideas. And here you can see a little bit closer how similar the domes. Yes, there are differences. There are several stories of colonnades, but nevertheless, it is structurally very much like the dome in Rome. And of course, I'm sure that most of you know that the Texas Capitol is slightly taller than the U.S. Capitol because this is Texas and that's the way we have to do things. But we have our own beautiful dome. The Texas Capitol is an absolutely stunningly beautiful building. If you haven't been there, you should go. It's made with native Texas granite from the region just west of Austin, the Marble Falls area, this beautiful pink granite. And once again, you can see the echoes of this dome. We even have a beautiful interior of the dome that looks very much like some of the others here, but of course with our Lone Star in it. So the longevity of these ideas from the Romans and from the Renaissance in particular are very much with us today. Thank you.